Well, hey guys, Mrs. Shelton here. As you can see, now that we are online learning for a whole lot of time now, I kind of just went with, all right, why not? Hair in a messy bun and just stay in my sweats and stay comfortable and get work done. So hopefully you guys are finding your new normal as we do this online thing. So today I am talking to you about chapter 42. So it's our second to the last chapter that we're going to be covering in Unit 8 on ecosystems. And so for chapter 42, it is ecosystems and energy for our ecology unit. So what you guys should have out is you should have out your chapter 42 notes outline. That's going to go over the important parts from your reading as you go through those. Also your free response questions, practice on those as well. So make sure you guys have those out. And what I want to be able to do with you is go over chapter 42, just some of the main ideas of chapter 42 and the ones that College Board will definitely be expecting you guys to understand. So with this, this particular PowerPoint is also available for you on Schoology. But in this, most of the information is actually a repeat of some of the content that you've already had with me back at chapter 1, but then also just some of your middle school and regular biology. And it's very intuitive. So it's not a difficult chapter, but just important for you to read, get more skills in understanding just the concepts. So in chapter 42, ecosystems and energy, here's kind of your opening question. And it's really kind of understanding our food chains and food pyramids and how nutrients actually play a big role here. So this opening question is asking you here about this little Arctic fox. And so this Arctic fox was actually an introduced species on some grassland islands. And because it was good hunting at the time, and they wanted to have that hunting availability, so they introduced this fox. They wanted it for the pelts. But in this introduction of this particular fox, it actually transformed this biome from a grassland into tundra. And so at the end, we'll come back to this particular question, and hopefully you can understand how just this introduction of this new species can actually change it to a completely different biome, just based on changing the nutrient supply that happens to be there. So we will come back to that in just a second. Now, here are the chapter 42 from the test prep review series. So if you take a look up here, again, we're still on topic 10 in that test prep review series. That's the ecology topic. This is pages 280 to 285. And there really are 4 you must knows in this particular section. So the first one is how energy flows through the ecosystem. By understanding the terms related to food chains and food webs, we addressed those terms in chapter 41, but we will readdress them again today. We will also need to make sure that we understand the difference between gross primary productivity and net productivity. So those are things that this goes back to our understanding of photosynthesis and our autotrophs, which they're the most important organisms in an ecosystem. And then we need to make sure that we're reviewing our biogeochemical cycles, especially the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle might be slightly new to you for a couple of those particular terms. But then how do these biogeochemical cycles impact individual organisms and or populations within the ecosystem? And it's this particular you must know that's going to take us back to our original question of how that Arctic fox actually changed the entire ecosystem there. So let's go ahead and start with this diagram that you guys should remember from way back when we started this journey together, our AP Bio journey. We started this with chapter 1, and I gave you the basic mantra that you guys need to make sure that you understand, is that energy flows chemical cycles. So from this diagram, when we talk about energy flow, energy always originates from the sun, unless we're talking about our thermal vents in the ocean. But for the most part, energy is going to flow and just simply transform. Remember our law of conservation of energy. Law of conservation of energy tells us that energy can't be created or destroyed. It just changes form. And so from sun to photosynthesis, it goes to our stored chemical energy. But then when we have our heterotrophs or any cellular respiration process, we're taking that stored chemical energy and we're converting that into a mechanical energy with ATP. And then that is getting lost as heat, which is a very unorganized form of energy. So energy then is just going to flow through ecosystems, through living things. But what we have to also then remember is that chemicals cycle. When we talk about the amount of carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur and um, those those materials are, there's a finite amount of those materials on our planet. And so those continuously recycle for life to be able to continue. So we need to talk about some of those biogeochemical cycles when we're actually talking about that cycling aspect. So energy flows, chemical cycle, make sure that we're understanding that aspect of it. Now, from this diagram here too, you're seeing this word, your primary producers. Remember, your primary producers are your autotrophs. Your autotrophs are going to be, for the most part, they're going to be your photosynthetic organisms that are converting then sun into stored chemical energy. Now, your primary consumers then are your herbivores. Your primary consumers are all heterotrophs. They have to eat some other organism. They have to obtain their stored chemical energy from another source. They can't make it from inorganic molecules. So your primary consumers are going to be your herbivores, and then you've got your secondary, tertiary, and then even potentially your quaternary consumers that are also your heterotrophs as well. Now, this term over here is actually detritus, and understanding a new eating term, which are your detritivores. Detritus is dead stuff. I mean, that's really what it is. Your detritus. So your plants that die, your herbivores that die, your carnivores that die. Well, there's decomposers, and you've heard that word decomposers. That's what detritivores are. So these microorganisms that eat the dead stuff and are going to break down those chemicals to be able to recycle those chemicals back through living things. But these detritivores, these detritivores are heterotrophs, and they're getting their energy from the stored chemical energy that is in all this material that has died. I would argue that without detritivores, the whole life cycle stops. And I actually think that they are maybe even more important than our primary producers. So argue that with me if you want to on what's more important, detritivores or primary producers. So there is a bio nerd question for you. Now, in 42.2, so here is actually some fungi that are actually acting as detritivores, and they are using the stored energy that is in this particular log. And this log has some stored chemical energy, and they are simply using that stored chemical energy as their nutrient source, is what they are doing. Now, 42.2, in this particular section, this is where you're going to be having some new terms. And the new terms that you need to make sure that you are understanding is the difference between your gross primary productivity of an ecosystem and your net primary productivity. When we are talking about productivity, we are talking about the amount of photosynthesis that happens. So with the amount of photosynthesis that happens, when we talk gross, gross is that total amount of photosynthesis. How much energy has now been converted from the sun now to organic molecules? That's our gross primary productivity. But what we have to remember is these primary consumers, well, they still perform cellular respiration too. So when they perform cellular respiration, they are using some of that stored chemical energy. So this is where what we end up getting is we get a net productivity. That net productivity is now the amount of stored energy that's available for the rest of the organisms in the ecosystem. So this particular equation should make sense. So I've got my gross primary productivity, but now I subtract out the amount of energy used for cellular respiration by those primary consumers. That gives me my net gain, the net gain that is now available to the rest of the ecosystem. So for those of you who have a job, you get if you're making $15 an hour, which you're lucky if you are, you're not going to get truly $15 an hour. I mean, you can calculate up after 10 hours, you should get $150, but you got to pay your taxes. And so in paying your taxes, your paycheck ends up becoming about $100 because that's what's available for you to spend after you remove those taxes that had to be paid. So that's another way to think about it. Now, here you can actually see kind of globally where we're actually seeing that net primary productivity. And when we determine this net primary productivity, you should be able to determine that amount of sunlight. And so we look along the equator and we're going to be seeing kind of these higher numbers of primary production per year. Well, sunlight obviously is going to be the biggest factor, and sun availability is the biggest factor in determining how much productivity can happen, since it's based on photosynthesis. But then, of course, then we have to factor in some of the other nutrients that are available as well for that productivity to occur. Now, when we talk about primary production, one of the things that I need you guys to understand, so things that do limit productivity are definitely nutrients. Nitrogen and phosphorus typically are some of the limiting nutrients that determine how much growth can take place. So remember which macromolecules your nitrogen and phosphorus are going to be a part of. Sulfur would also be one that is a limiting factor as well. But nitrogen and phosphorus typically are the most limiting nutrients that limit then how much growth, because your nitrogen and your phosphorus are going to be necessary for your proteins and for your nucleic acids. So we need to have those in abundance so plants then can continue to grow. Because remember, photosynthesis is not just about making glucose. Photosynthesis is about making the precursors to all organic material. So what limits the growth of life in a particular area is first sunlight for photosynthesis, but then second are those nutrients of nitrogen and phosphorus that now might limit the other macromolecules that can be made by that primary productivity. Now, an interesting factor in how those limiting nutrients can affect ecosystems is actually the process of eutrophication. When we say eutrophication, this is actually something that happens in water systems often due to pollution. A lot of runoff from farms, a lot of excess use of fertilizers can cause lakes to eutrophy, which actually is the death of a lake or even a stagnant riverway. Because what happens is excess nitrogen and phosphorus get into this aquatic ecosystem. Well, what ends up happening in this increase of nitrogen and phosphorus, well, now what we end up getting is this algal bloom that occurs. So this absolute massive amount of these algae that now start growing because woohoo, we're not limited anymore. Well, unfortunately, they utilize all of the nitrogen and phosphorus in this algal bloom, and then they start to die. Well, as they die, well, now we've got detritivores that are saying woohoo also, because they're starting to now break down all of this detritus. Well, they are also using oxygen for that respiration, which now they're using up all the oxygen that happens to be in this lake as well. And so eventually what we end up getting is this loss of food, of habitat. There's no more oxygen production because they've deprived, then with this algal bloom, we've stopped the sunlight from actually getting in. So the seagrass isn't performing photosynthesis, releasing oxygen, and it's a whole big old mess. So read about eutrophication, understand kind of how that shows us too, how some of these limiting nutrients, now we change that to increase or even decrease that, how that can change the entire ecosystem. So here's just a picture of nice pretty lake. Somebody's sewage got dumped into that nice pretty lake, and now we had this excess of nutrients that now caused this algal bloom that now, I saved you from showing you the picture of the dead fish floating in this particular lake. So that would be eutrophication. Now, in 42.3, in that particular section, so this is energy transfer between trophic levels. If you remember last chapter, I was talking to you guys about our food chains. So starting with our primary producers to primary consumers, secondary consumers to tertiary consumers. I told you guys the rule of 10%. So that rule of 10% means that from that primary producer level, if they had 10,000 joules of energy, the maximum amount of energy they can afford to pass up to the next level is only 10% of their energy. So with this is a typical efficiency level of a 10% efficiency level. So this would be our trophic pyramid, and within this trophic pyramid, this is showing us that energy efficiency, and this is usually the maximum efficiency that can occur. So 10% gets passed up to primary consumers. From primary consumers, only about 10% of that energy can now go to secondary consumers. And then from secondary consumers, only about 10% of that can go up to tertiary consumers. And you can also see with this loss, this is also why in a quaternary consumer, that's going to be really hard for a quaternary consumer that's got to be large enough to be able to feed off of this to now survive off of only 1 joule. Now, our trophic pyramids can also be represented as biomass pyramids. And so that biomass, when we talk about biomass, so again, from this level, now we're looking at that dry weight. Dry mass means we've taken out the water. Water is not an energy source. So dry mass now is all that organic material that happens to be in the living things there, which that's stored chemical energy. So it's another way of actually looking at the amount of energy that's available at each of those levels. So here we also see your primary producer is always going to be the biggest, your consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary level. So with that, recognize we can show these trophic levels by biomass. We can also show it by energy as well. So recognize those. Now, in 42.4, what we need to make sure that we are understanding is we are understanding some of the main key terms in our biogeochemical cycles. So in this particular picture here, you are seeing the water cycle. And with the water cycle should make plenty of sense to you. You know that there's precipitation, you know that there's evaporation, but what we also need to make sure that we are recognizing is this word transpiration. So with transpiration, we've learned this term before, but we're going to address it again. And when we talk about this transpiration, this is this process of how water moves through plants. Remember that water actually has to move up through, based on water potential, moves from the roots up and out the stomata of leaves. Well, that's evapotranspiration. That's how a lot of groundwater ends up getting back up into the atmosphere. So that's a huge, huge part of the water cycle. But obviously we've got evaporation, we've got precipitation, but we absolutely need to know transpiration in terms of how that affects the water cycle. Carbon cycle. So carbon cycle you are very, very familiar with too. You should be, because we need to make sure that we are understanding how right now we're getting this constant increase in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And from looking at this diagram, it's not hard to figure out that we are burning way too many fossil fuels and wood. We're taking our carbon stores and we're releasing too much carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. And if you look, the only thing that can pull carbon dioxide back down out of the atmosphere is photosynthesis. So make sure you recognize photosynthesis. You know that photosynthesis is using what are my reactants, what are my products of photosynthesis. So carbon dioxide and water are my reactants. But then also recognize from cellular respiration, the waste products of cellular respiration then are carbon dioxide and water. So you do get some people who aren't, science savvy who are like, well, we as people are putting too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that human activity of burning way too much fossil fuels and wood and releasing, because these fossil fuels, this was carbon stores that have been in the ground for millions and millions of years. So now we're taking those in mass quantities and now we're releasing those into the atmosphere in mass quantities. Normally, photosynthesis and cellular respiration should take care of itself, is what should be happening. And then our carbon dioxide levels should stay relatively stable over time. So understand just that role of photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and then the burning of fossil fuels in the carbon cycle. And if you don't know why carbon is important for living things, I don't know how to help you. Organic material. All organic material has carbon. Okay, so this particular cycle, this is the one that I know you guys are least familiar with, is the nitrogen cycle. Now, when we talk about the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen is super abundant in our atmosphere. When you take a big, deep breath in, 80% of what you are breathing in is nitrogen, but it's nitrogen in this atmospheric form of N2. Well, N2, we know that we need nitrogen for all of our proteins and all of our nucleic acids. So all living things, all cells need to have a supply of nitrogen, and plants need to be able to use nitrogen in order to build those macromolecules for us. However, N2 is not a form that is usable for plants. So the form that is available for plants that plants can actually use is they can actually use ammonia, so ammonium, this NH4, and they can also use nitrate, NO3. Now, where a lot of this fixing of nitrogen occurs, and this is what we need to make sure that we all know, is the process of nitrogen fixation. And in nitrogen fixation, what is actually happening, and this is an example you really should know, in nitrogen fixation, this is where there are bacteria And these bacteria will actually fix atmospheric nitrogen into a usable form for plants to be able to use and assimilate into their proteins or proteins and nucleic acids. So assimilate means that they're now incorporating it and using it. So when we talk about fixation, there is actually an example. It's an example of symbiosis that we're going to need to know, and you may need to pull out of your hat for the AP test, but it's actually a mutualistic relationship that some plants actually have with rhizobium. And rhizobium is this particular bacteria that actually forms these root nodules in legumes. The legumes being a species of plants that are beans and bean producing. Alfalfa is actually something that's used quite a bit in crop rotation in order to build up nitrogen content in soils. That happens to be a legume. And what ends up happening is the plant roots end up creating these nodules or these homes for these rhizobium to actually live in. And so the rhizobium benefit by actually now having a home. They don't get flushed away with water. But then the legumes actually benefit not just even from the nitrogen fixation, but it's also going to help a little bit of absorption of nutrients as well for them. So that's a mutualistic relationship between legumes and rhizobium for the purpose of nitrogen fixation, this converting of N2 into a usable form of nitrogen, either to ammonium or to nitrates. We should also know what nitrification is, just recognize that. But here, really, really important to recognize the importance of bacteria in the nitrogen cycle. Super, super important for us to understand. Lastly, in this particular chapter, in 42.5, a lot of what you read about ecology is what I title the humans are stupid and have been destroying our ecosystem. But in 42.5, you actually start learning about what are humans doing to actually remediate and to fix the problem. Because one of our philosophies that I talk about a lot in class is when we know better, we do better. And fortunately, a lot of people, a lot of ecologists, scientists have recognized that some of our practices that we thought were good in the end, in the long run, are actually harming the environment in ways that we didn't predict. So, restoration ecology is actually a really important part of understanding how do we live symbiotically with everything else on this planet. So, two terms that you should be recognizing is you should be recognizing bioremediation and biological augmentation. So, with bioremediation, when we actually have some types of restoration happening, what we recognize is that sometimes we need to reinstate some of the plant life back into this ecosystem. And so that would be a bioremediation where we're actually now putting some of the organisms and species back into that area so it can come back to its natural state. But we can also have biological augmentation. And in that particular case, what we're doing in biological augmentation is we're now actually just supplying some of those base nutrients, some of those limiting nutrients that were missing or stripped out of that area. So now that natural type of succession can actually happen and it can restore itself. So your textbook is actually going to give you some different examples of actually how some restoration is taking place and how humans are trying to fix some of the problems that we have created in order to be able to allow some of these ecosystems to self-maintain and get back to their natural state. So you can read about those if you want to. So now back to our opening question. Cute little Arctic fox. Not so cute because it was an introduced species onto some of these Arctic islands and transformed some of these Arctic grasslands into tundra. How did it do it? Well, you got to actually ask and kind of look at what's that food web that this Arctic fox is going to be disrupting, being an introduced species. Well, there's a reason why we've got this gull here in this picture. Arctic fox, its primary food source, all the birds. So why then, if we now have this fox eating the birds, well, how did that change grassland into tundra? Well, grasslands actually require a higher nitrogen content. Well, now you are, if Mr. Fox here is killing the birds, well, the birds aren't dropping their guano or their feces that's rich, rich, rich in nitrogen. And that's really what their bird poop is they're excreting their nitrogenous waste, Well, now the soil is not getting that nitrogen, and tundra doesn't require, so all of the permafrost and some of the plant life in tundra doesn't require as much nitrogen for that. So there is just kind of a wrap up of how energy flows through ecosystems, how matter then cycles through ecosystems, and kind of understanding our representation of kind of that energy and that cycling of nutrients. So with that, that is your chapter 42 summary. Hopefully that helps you guys in understanding the content here. And we've got one more lesson, and then we're going to start our review process after this. So anyway, hope you guys are doing good online, and we'll have a Zoom check-in here pretty soon too to also see how you guys are doing. So hopefully doing good. We'll see ya.